All right, we are live. Welcome everyone to the spoiler-free and spoiler-filled chat of Gardens of the Moon by Stephen Erickson, book one of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. This is long awaited. We finished the book a few weeks ago and have been waiting to do this chat, and we are very excited about it. We're very excited to have everyone in the chat join us. And so I think the first thing I want to do is just have everyone go around, because in addition to the co-hosts of this read-along, which include Ian, Jordan, and Josh, we are also joined by a special guest, AP Canavan from A Critical Dragon, and we are so excited he's here. He's, huge reason that I feel as confident as I felt diving into this series, and I think it's just a great addition to this conversation for Gardens of the Moon. So, AP, if you want to start us off and just introduce yourself and to anyone else who in the chat may not know you and everything around it.
Firstly, thank you very much for inviting me. I love talking about the Malazan Book of the Fallen, but I love getting a chance to talk to other readers. So thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you for inviting me. I really do appreciate this. I hope this is as much fun for you as it is for me. So
I'm excited.
just as a brief, obviously I have my channel, A Critical Dragon. I now am a freelance developmental editor. I've done work for Stephen Erickson, and I was an advanced reader for Stephen Erickson starting at, I think it was Toll the Hounds. So that was my entry into knowing Stephen Erickson and the books from that angle. But I started out reading them long before, so that's who I am.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing. Ian, you can
I'll follow that. Yes, I'm Ian of Ian the Reader. I'm allegedly a booktuber, and I post book reviews on other platforms like Instagram, Goodreads, TikTok, all that fun stuff. Really excited to be here. I have a question for our guest. Oh, he just muted himself, though. I was curious, AP, if you had to guess, how many Malazan Book of the Fallen themed videos have you been a part of?
Including my own?
Including your own, sure. Why not?
Probably about 60.
That's impressive.
Maybe more.
Wow.
Awesome. Well, we're glad you could be here with us this time.
Jordan.
Hello, I'm Jordan from Jordan Reads. I also read a lot of fantasy, and this is my first time reading Gardens of the Moon, so I'm excited to talk about it.
Cool. Josh, you want to take it?
I'm Josh, Red Fury Books, and I have to give a little plug. If you happen to be on this channel and you're watching this and you haven't actually subscribed to Alex's channel, I just noticed that he's at 3.99K subscribers. So he's right about to be 4,000. So if for some reason you're here and you haven't subscribed to Alex's channel, please hit that subscribe button. Anyway, this is my first time with Malazan Book of the Fallen, and I'm excited to talk about it. Is just the reason I jumped in with this is for these discussions, because I know it's a notoriously challenging book series. Whether that's deserved or not, I guess we'll start talking about that in a few minutes here. But I'm looking forward to all 10 of these discussions as we make our way through the series.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for the kind words, Josh. I appreciate it. I think to kick us off, we can kind of talk some spoiler-free thoughts real briefly just about this reading experience. I think in addition, when it comes to this read-along specifically, we started coming up with the idea of kicking off this series read-along a few months ago, probably August or September of 2022. And so we had a few months of anticipation for this read-along to start. And probably in addition to that, a lot of us have known of the series. This has been a series that has been built up on BookTube and outside of BookTube quite a bit. And for good and bad reasons, some people it's become a series that is notoriously regarded as being overly difficult and complicated. And so when you're for this read along, I feel like a lot of us had these expectations of, oh no, is this going to be something that we can tackle? Hopefully this is something we enjoy. And I just wanted to kind of have you guys share your experience diving into this first book for the first time. For me, this was the only book in the Malazan Book of the Fallen that I have read. So this was a reread for me, which was an interesting experience.
Cheater! He's a cheater!
I know. I know. But yeah, I just want to hear what you guys thought going into this for the first time, whether it's Erickson's writing style or this book specifically, and just finally diving into the series.
I'll start. So I think that in and of itself, I mean, yeah, there's a huge reputation, and we talked a little bit about this before we went live, but there's a little bit of this, like, I say a little bit, there's this huge reputation for this series of being like really difficult to read and things like that, and just, you know, a huge effort. And I think that, like, if you were just to read a page of this book, it's not difficult. You know, like, the writing is very compelling. I think the characters are very well developed and engaging. Like, there was such a great cast of characters, and it was really easy to understand, like, their motivations, and, like, as much as we got of them, I think it was really easy to attach ourselves to them. So the book itself isn't hard. I think it just stems from, like, reader expectation. So, like, if you can just let go of expectations of traditional storytelling or anything like that, I think that you're going to have a lot better of an experience, because the actual experience of reading the book is easy. It's great. You know, it's very readable. It's funny at times too. There was a lot of the characters or dialogue that I thought was really funny. But no, reading it itself was not hard. I still don't really know what went on 100%, but I'm just going to reiterate what everyone keeps telling me, like, that's fine. Like, I think we have this tendency to be like, oh, I don't know what's going on, and I feel like everybody else does. No, nobody else knows, like, 100% what's going on, and that's intentional. Like, it almost feels like, rather than a book, it's like you're being dropped into the world, like, in actuality. And, like, if you were to just to be, like, picked up and dropped into any world of any fiction story ever, there's not just going to be this character who walks up and gives you all this exposition and explains the whole world to you. You're going to figure out it as you go along. And that's what it felt like for me, is like Erickson just put me literally in the world of Malazan, and I was left to figure it out. And it felt very lived in because of that. It was challenging just in my head, but, like, looking back on it, I can say, like, oh, that wasn't hard to read, you know? So.
Yeah, I completely agree with Ian. It was like I was expecting it to be a lot harder than it was, and, like, you are definitely just dropped right into the story without a whole lot of, like, context for what happened previously. But if you just, like, trust the process, it ended up not being nearly as hard as I thought. And like Ian said, reading it page to page, like, you understand what's going on. A lot of it is just, like, the larger context of the story you don't have all the answers to yet. So as you go, it's not hard. It's not a hard book to follow by any means.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. It's the context that made it a challenge. One thing I've thought about, just kind of reflecting upon it, because I've had time to think about the book, having finished it, a lot of the book reminded me of, you know, when you start a big fantasy series, a lot of times there's a prologue that you read, and you never have the context in that prologue, and you don't understand what's going on. It felt like there was just a lot of that in the entire book as it went on. There were just all these different scenes that didn't go on. I didn't understand the factions and things like that. But what was easy is it was easy to gravitate towards characters, to understand the scenes, because his writing style is very clear. I found that for me, I had to just kind of go with it, as we said before. But I also had to slow down my reading pace to really enjoy it. And there were times I was still very frustrated with it. But overall, by the time I got to the end, I was in a good place about it. But I think just realizing that he's going to, I figured out the rhythm about halfway through. He would drop a term at you, and then a chapter or two later, he'd then explain what that term was, because it would organically work its way into the narrative. And once I got over the fact that something would be dropped in there and I wouldn't understand it, I'd say, okay, he'll explain it later. And I would just trust that he would. And then finally he did. So I think that was just a personal hurdle I had to get over. But once I did, it helped my enjoyment 100%.
So if I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but what I understood from what Ian, Jordan, and Joseph just said is the what happens in the book is perfectly clear. That it was easy to read. It was easy to understand. That isn't difficult. You understand what happens. Mm-hmm. The difficulty, I think, and this is where I might be putting words in your mouth, is the why it's important.
Yes.
The why things are connected. That sometimes is obscured from you because it hasn't been explained to you. Mm-hmm. So when we were talking about, Malazan has a reputation for being difficult. And you go, it's not difficult. You understand perfectly clearly what happens. So why is there this expectation that it's difficult? And I think it's this expectation that readers now have that everything is going to be explained to them ahead of time, or when something happens, the narrative will kind of grind to a halt and a character will explain what just happened so you understand it. And that is a form of storytelling that wasn't exactly mainstream for adult fantasy. You didn't have that. Yes, Gardens of the Moon drops you in without an extensive preamble or build-up to it. You don't have that long introduction. You don't have starting off in the Shire and then slowly things being revealed to you piecemeal over time. What you have is, no, the events are happening. But as Josh pointed out, as these things are happening, complex ideas and different terms and concepts get explained as you need them. So something gets introduced and you live with it for a while as you're reading, and you then conjecture about it, you think about it, you work out part of the context in your own mind as you're reading, and then it'll either be confirmed or you'll get a different explanation in the narrative organically as it comes up. Because, as Ian pointed out, like those stories where, a character walks into an inn and it's, I hear you have an evil Dark Lord. And the innkeeper goes, oh yes, traveler, welcome to my inn. We have an evil Dark Lord. Let me explain all about this evil Dark Lord. And you go, but if you have an evil Dark Lord, would he really want you referring to him as an evil Dark Lord and telling this complete stranger who you have never met all about him? That always felt so false. And yet that's the kind of, it gets glossed over a lot in certain novels, but that's the technique that's used to feed the reader exposition, to feed the reader the context, to make us more comfortable in the world. But when part of the story is about trying to create something that is closer to a verisimilitudinous reality, which is what we all keep saying that we want things to be more realistic. You go, there is nothing realistic about someone going, let me explain magic to you. So this is my magic. That is entirely artificial. And yet it's part of narrative that we have come to depend upon, that it's almost like a crutch for us, because secondary worlds are complex. They aren't like our world. So we want bits of it explained. Magic systems don't exist in our world. We want the magic explained so that we have a handle on it. We understand it. We need to know up front. But that is a much more modern concern than you saw typically in fantasy, stretching back from the early pulps all the way through Tolkien, all the way up to the late 20th century. This whole idea of explaining the magic, that is actually relatively new. And yet, because that is now a dominant form in the genre, when people come into fantasy, they read what is currently popular quite often before they go back to look at now earlier works. And Gardens of the Moon was, came out in the late 90s. So it is over 20 years old. And, when you go back in time like that, there are different narrative paradigms. There are different techniques that were more commonplace. And even then, Gardens of the Moon was in dialogue and in argument with some of the things that were being done in the genre when Erikson was writing it. And those things have changed. So I personally, when I read it, I think it was the first 2 chapters and went, I'm not in the mood for this, and put it down. And then about a month later, I picked it up again and I got about 100 pages in and I was like, actually, I have this other thing that I need to be doing. And then I sat down and went, right, I'm just going to read this. And I read it cover to cover in the space of a couple of days. I went, this is brilliant. But technically, I DNF'd it twice. I don't have a problem. I'm not ashamed. I do that with lots of books. That you pick up, you start, and then you're just not in the mood for it at that point in time. But there wasn't an entire social media ecosystem saying, this book is really difficult. You need to be worried about this book. You need to fear this book. This book is, you need a black belt in fantasy. You need a PhD. None of that existed. It just was another fantasy book. And because of that, I never had the same sort of fear or expectations about it that I think that we have now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel the same way. I mean, this was, like I said, it was a reread for me. And the first time I read it was a few years ago before I knew BookTube. Like, sure, I had looked up a couple book reviews here and there before, but was not watching BookTube nearly as much as I was later. And I was kind of just looking for a new fantasy series to read. And I was looking up, best fantasy series that aren't Lord of the Rings and the other ones that I've read. And Malazan was, right at the top. And so I was like, all right, I'll get it. I went to the store, picked up Gardens of the Moon, started reading it, and kind of just went with it. I was very confused, but I had a fun time. And when I came back for this reread, I didn't remember a lot of things that happened in it, but I remembered certain situations. So I remembered the city of like Darujhistan and that whole atmosphere. And I remember the Siege of Pale scene. And coming back into it, it was very interesting because while I was reading it, yes, I didn't remember those specifically, but I felt way more comfortable on this reread, which I don't know. I just found that to be very interesting. I saw a comment here. This is sorry. Chris says, I probably got this from AP, but the lack of explanation is like real life. In real life, you don't get constant context. People don't explain their motivations. You have to figure out as you go. And honestly, this is one of the most common frustrations I see readers having is actually the character motivation, because if you don't understand what the motivation for that character is, it kind of is hard for some people to feel attached to that character. And so even though all these big events are happening on the page, why should they care? And so I think that's probably the most common frustration I've seen with the series overall. And I think that's just comes down to the individual reader. And if you've read this book or a couple of other books in the series and you just don't find yourself attached to the characters, then it might just not be a series for you. And that's totally okay. I think for me, I felt pretty attached to these characters in this book, even in just a short amount of time I was with them for just this book before we moved into Deadhouse Gates. And I just think it was a very interesting aspect of this book when it came to the character introductions and the development throughout this specific installment of the series. But, with that said, we can dive into spoilers. So I don't know if anyone else has anything to talk about when it comes to just general non-spoiler thoughts, or we can just start talking about, some of the more specific things related to this book.
Well, I have a quick question for you guys, but particularly on that point that was just raised, which is, were you confused about anyone's particular motivations? Were there any characters that you went, I don't understand why they're doing that?
My confusion was not with characters. Mine was with just understanding where everybody was, like in the context of everything. Who was against whom. I didn't understand some of the proper names of things. Because again, he would say Sisti Andy and then he'd explain it later. But as far as characters were concerned, I never had any trouble with that specific part of it. At least how they were interacting with those around each other.
Yeah, I agree.
I think my biggest thing was like, I'm used to a fantasy story, like stories in general, where the main character is very evident, even from the beginning. And with this, like, you get the prologue and you're like, okay, who are these people? And then they're there, and then like they're sort of not there. But then also like it skips a bunch of time, and so contextually, like who I'm supposed to be paying attention to was kind of hard to keep track of. But I mean, you just kind of have to let that go. I was just gonna say also, kind of in regard to just like the book as a whole, like it makes a lot of sense to me that this is originally was like an RPG, because it feels almost like that, where you're playing a role-playing game almost when you're reading this, rather than like the traditional feeling of like with a lot of books, I feel like you can really feel the hand of the author in the work. Like you can see the puppet mastering of like, here's the exposition, here's the explanation, here's this and that. With this, I feel like you really are just experiencing it like as if you're there for real. And like sometimes that was frustrating, but at the same time, I also see why he did do that. Like one example is the way that he sometimes wouldn't give you a character's name until after a while. Like with, I think, the Fisher girl in chapter 1 or something like that. You're like, okay, who's this Fisher girl? And then she ends up being this character that has a lot more complexity to her. I like the way that he did that, because it's almost like you're seeing them in a moment rather than for who they are. And you're kind of supposed to develop your own feelings and opinions about them from that, and then that is kind of the context for everything else that comes, which another author would kind of establish who they are and then show you in a scene, if that makes sense. So
yeah, I agree. I didn't have a hard time with why characters were doing things. I just had more trouble following, like what Josh said, like what side everyone's on. And I'm as I was saying before we got live, I'm partway through Dead House Gates and I'm still having that problem. So I think a lot of it is just like, which side are they on? Are they fighting for the Malazan Empire? Like a lot of that, but like their individual actions they were taking, I was not confused by.
Yeah, right. Exactly. I feel the same way.
Yeah, I do have to admit. Go ahead.
I was going to say, Jordan, that was a really interesting point about like trying to work out which side people are on.
Yeah.
And you go, why do we need to know that? And you think of how many books that we've read where you go, these are the good guys.
Yeah.
They're on the side of good. Those are the bad guys. They're the side of bad. And it's two sides. Now think about any geopolitical event in our world. Are there two sides? Or are there, well, there might be two people in that conflict, but then there's these people using them as a proxy. And then, well, they're saying that they're on that side, but they're actually doing this. It is always a lot more complicated. And with fantasy stories, we got used to this very simple and simplified binary of good, evil, and we're on the side of good, and they're going to fight evil. And it even became a joke. Dana Wynne Jones referred to the common trope of the perennially understaffed forces of good facing off against absolute evil, where you have like the Fellowship of the Ring going off to fight Sauron and this army of orcs. Now, that's obviously like an oversimplification, but think of the number of fantasy novels where there's a small, tiny core group of heroes and they're facing off against this evil empire. And you go, right, how realistic is that?
Right.
One squad is going to take on an entire empire. If you saw that set in the real world, you'd go, maybe not. But you can have a story like Saving Private Ryan where you have one squad going through territory to rescue one person. But they're not infiltrating the whole of Germany to take down Adolf Hitler and to take down the evil empire. You know, that's not what Saving Private Ryan is about. And Ian had made the point there about, you know, we're not following a main character. But if you remember the Steven Spielberg miniseries, Band of Brothers, that was about Easy Company. And, you know, you started off with, oh, here are the characters and we're going to follow them all the way through. And then, no, actually, because a bunch of them leave and we follow different characters because we're following the company. We're following that unit and people move in and out of it and people got promoted out of it and they disappeared from the narrative and then reappeared later on. That it wasn't about following a key person. It was about following what was actually happening as people moved in and out of it. So, you know, that it's uncommon in a lot of fantasy, but it doesn't mean that it's uncommon in narrative in general, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense.
That's actually like probably one of my favorite parts about the book, in the fact that, you know, in part one we see everything as it relates to the Malazan army and the Siege of Pale and all of these characters, and you could tell there's a bunch of inner turmoil going on that side in and of itself, and there's a lot of good and bad being mixed, and you have a bunch of different motivations going on between the different characters on just that side alone. And then we go over to the city of Darujhistan. We get introduced to a whole bunch of new characters who have their own sides of inner turmoil going on between them, and there's a lot of, you know, mixed motivations and people trying to use different situations to achieve certain goals. And I like that because it doesn't give you a clear good and bad. It doesn't give you a clear evil versus the light or whatever it is that we see in a lot of other fantasy. And instead you just get this whole mix of levels of good and bad, quote unquote, and just these characters who have both good sides and bad sides, and they're just in a specific situation and they've been influenced by their specific upbringing and their situation, and they're pursuing what, you know, that situation has led them to be at that point in their life. And, you know, I love when books do that. And I found that to be a really rewarding aspect of this book in particular. And I'm finding the same thing in Dead House Gates, where I'm at on that side as well.
I can see it being really important, though. Like, I know we've talked a bit about how like social media has created this kind of idea about what the series is and isn't, and it can be kind of harmful to people who might otherwise enjoy it. I do think it's a good thing, though, to have the right perspective on it going in, because I think everybody reads for different reasons, and everybody is like, I'm a mood reader, and so sometimes I don't want a book. I saw somebody in the comments said like it encourages the reader to have like a more active role. Sometimes when I read a book, I don't want to have an active role. You know, sometimes I just want to sit there and read something that's going to feel almost like I'm watching a movie where like, yeah, do the work for me. And so I think it's important to recognize, like, one, it's good to be in the right headspace for this. Just like you said, AP, how you DNF'd it twice. Like, it just wasn't, you weren't in the right headspace for it, or you had other things going on. And so it was really easy to put it aside. Like, I think there is like a right headspace to be in for this book, especially if you're used to more traditional storytelling, if that makes sense.
But I'd argue you have to be in the right headspace for any book, because sometimes you pick a book up and you go, oh, stop spoon feeding me. I want to be engaged. I don't want to be beaten over the head with this. Oh, I'll put it away until one day when I'm lying on the sofa feeling sick and go, I'll just read it.
Exactly. I envy adaptable readers who can just pick up a book, whatever it is, and read it, because I am the type, I need to be in that mood for that type of story, or it's just not going to work with me. A 5-star on one day could be a 3-star and vice versa. So
I completely agree.
All right. Well, I guess on that note, we can move into, so, you know, full spoilers for Gardens of the Moon from this point on. So if you're in the chat and you haven't finished the book, just a heads up, from here on out, we'll be talking spoilers. So I think the best place to start with, based on that discussion that we started with earlier, is to just dive right into the prologue. So the prologue of Gardens of the Moon, like many prologues, like Josh was saying, does throw you at, like a lot of prologues in fantasy will throw you in there. You don't have a lot of context for what's going on and then explains it later. Gardens of the Moon does the same thing without the explaining later part necessarily. But we get introduced to a young boy named Ganos Paran, who is with a commander of the Bridge Burners, who I believe is Whiskey Jack in the scene. And we find out this person named Surly has renamed herself Lassine, and she is now the Empress of the Malazan Empire. And that she shows up. And then this is the discussion that we have at the beginning of this book. And I know this is a pretty short prologue for this compared to the chapters in this book. But I think what I've heard from a lot of Malazan readers over the years is that this is one of the most rereadable sections of the series. And that once you finish the whole series, you can come back and this is like a really rewarding section of the book to read. And so I just wanted to ask, you know, AP, what are your thoughts on the prologue without spoilers for the rest of the series, and just everyone else? Like, what was your, did you have any opinions on these characters right from the start? Paran as a young boy, or, you know, Empress Lassine, because this is one of the only scenes in the book where we get to see Lassine in person, like in the scene. So that is interesting.
Like, weirdly enough, I think I have a 20-minute video on the first 2 paragraphs. You know, that's because I do short, concise videos. Totally. Because, you know, I never ramble on. But let's think about this prologue. So what we see in the prologue is a young boy, young noble boy, and he is standing at the parapet overlooking the Malaz city, and there's a riot going on. And he's standing with a military commander, and then another soldier comes up saying, oh, you know, letting them know that they're trying to handle this riot. And then Surly comes out, and she's taken this new name, Lassine. And of course, Ganos Paran, they all know what Lassine means, but he's the one who corrects them. So that's the author using a character to feed you the exposition, because there was no way for that naturally to come in, except it does naturally fit here, because Ganos is showing that he's very smart, he's well educated, he knows how to translate this, and he says out loud what Whiskey Jack had been going, shut up, don't say it, because he's talking to, I think it's Fiddler. And he doesn't want Fiddler to say it out loud. And then, of course, Surly turns up. And at this point, she's not the Empress. She's the power behind the throne. She's head of basically the secret police, the assassins, the Claw.
Yeah, the Claw, yeah.
And she's the administrator for the Empire, because as you sort of discover, like Canavan and Dancer kind of, oh, we're off to do this thing. And they just left the Empire to Lassine to run. And they went off and did things. So that's the situation. And we find out that Lassine, because we see this in the whole discussion we have, I think it's in chapter 9, the dinner scene. Lassine had ordered that the hedge witches and the wax witches and all of the magic users who weren't willing to submit to Malazan rule to become part of sort of the Malazan Empire's military might and magical might, that they were being put down in the Mouse Quarter. Laseen ordered that. And later on, we find out that that's where Tattersail is. That was Tattersail's first deployment, and it got out of hand. And at the end of that prologue, you have Ganos Parn saying that, oh, they've set fire to a slaughterhouse. They've set fire to like a butcher shop or something. As a reader, you're going, that's not a butcher shop that he's smelling. That's people.
Yeah.
That's how bad this has got. So that scene that is so pivotal to the dinner scene later on, we have now seen it externally without the context. And then later on, we get the context for it. So at that point in time, if you skip back to the prologue and you reread it, knowing that Lorne's family were there, that Tattersail is part of those soldiers doing that under Laseen's order, and now Lorne has become the adjunct under Laseen, you suddenly understand that entire power dynamic. And it explains why this is so important to Lorne, and why when she sort of sides with the Empire again, when she pushes down that personal response, when she becomes the adjunct and only the adjunct, how important that is. Because that decision, you understand all of this. And that's why the prologue is so incredibly important. And you can talk a lot about the symbolism in it, but that sequence tells you so much about Lorne, and is necessary for Lorne in that scene, and is necessary for Tattersail in that scene, and is necessary for Dujek and Whiskey Jack and the Bridge Burners. Like, you understand that they were all just doing their job, and Lorne is serving the very woman who ordered that riot put down. And that knowing that fact, and it's something I think some people kind of skip over, is that element. That's why when Lorne pushes it down and ignores that personal history, and she just becomes the adjunct, a part of her dies, a part of her humanity dies. And then that gets picked up again toward the end when she's almost thinking about not releasing Raist, not releasing the Jagged Tyrant. And she goes, no, I'm in for a penny, in for a punch. She's come that far. She is going to do the will of the Empire, because that is all that she has left. She has destroyed all these different elements of her own humanity. And she is such a tragic figure in Gardens of the Moon.
Geez, AP, I wish I could just have you in my ear while I'm reading the book, just to like. Yeah.
That was like
after every chapter, like
literally, no, like every sentence. Like he's like, "Did you just read that part?" Because that's, I love it. I love it.
But that makes sense. Like you guys have all read it. You you remember the dinner scene.
Did I?
Absolutely.
Oh, I remember the dinner scene. Yeah, that was. Thank you. That was one hell of a background for the prologue.
I mean, it really brought it full circle, just like for all of us. Even though we read it, it brought a lot of context. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But sorry, just on that point. But the weird thing is, so you say I just brought context to it, but that context
was from the book. Yeah, it's so hard to. That's the thing about it, is you're almost juggling as you're reading. It's like, here's this story, here's this part, here's these characters, and so it's very easy to not always connect the dots upon first read, which is almost like, as I was going through preparing for this discussion, I was almost like, man, I kind of wish I could just reread Gardens of the Moon again, just to kind of like pick up those pieces one more time and be like, okay, now that I've read that, this makes more sense, you know?
Yeah, I do feel like
with you. I was thinking the same thing today. Yeah, I was almost thinking, like, before I started at Dead House Gates, maybe I'll reread Gardens of the Moon, but then I'm not going to do that. That'll be just too much to keep doing.
Big commitment.
But, yeah.
Well,
but
when I started Dead House Gates, I read the first 2 chapters and I was like, okay, no. I had to go back and read a full recap of Gardens of the Moon because I was like, I don't remember what's going on. It's just so complex.
I think especially on a first read, your brain's just trying to process everything you're getting, is being told to you. So especially with the fact that, I mean, you are pretty quickly introduced to a ton of characters, and a whole bunch of different magic and locations and wars and battles that are going on. And this is all coming at you pretty quickly. So I think it is easy to not gloss over, but it's easy to, recognize the context in the moment. And then, maybe your brain spends its effort trying to figure out something else instead. And then there's just a lot of things where you're not really sure what you should be paying attention to, what you shouldn't be paying attention to. And that definitely is a conflict that persists.
I think this is something that a lot of modern texts have trained into us, which is the expectation that things are going to be signaled as this is important. Follow this thing. That we're only going to concentrate on these things. That a lot of modern texts have streamlined and simplified the process. And because that's predominantly what we read what's in the market now, that those create a set of expectations. They train us to read in a certain way. But when you read more widely, when you read different genres, when you read different time periods, the thing is you actually become accustomed to reading different styles of narrative. And because of that, you don't have the same expectations. So that when you're reading through, you aren't looking for, well, who's the main character? Because there are loads of different stories that don't have a main character. You aren't looking for, oh, they're going to explain what all of these are. You go, no, because there's loads of different stories that don't do that. Because you don't have those expectations, it becomes a lot easier. And the other thing that a lot of modern reading has encouraged is reading faster and faster and faster, to read more and more and more. The fear of missing out, the FOMO. Oh, I must read. Oh, they're talking about this book. I need to get that on my TBR. I have to read that. I listen to it on audiobook at 2 times speed while I'm reading that one physically, and like in the bath, I'll just immerse myself in a pulp made from this book so I can just absorb it through osmosis. The idea that you're trying to read more and more and more and faster, whereas that, again, very recent phenomenon. A lot of books were written with the idea that a reader would be sitting quietly and be taking their time, that you weren't trying to get through 500 pages in a single day, that you would go, I'm going to read 1 chapter and then I'm going to think about it. Like, think of all of those, what you think of as classic literature, that a lot of these books were written that you would read a chapter and stop and think about it. And that is not the mode that we are now trained to do with a lot of fantasy reading. Think of the number of books that the chapter ends almost on a cliffhanger, so that you immediately I have to turn the page to get to the next chapter and read on. And then the cliffhanger is almost automatically resolved. Or if it's not resolved in that chapter, it's resolved the chapter after that they've alternated. So there's a cliffhanger, then it cuts to a different, but I want to get back to that one, so I'll read through this chapter really quickly to get back to that thing to find out what happened. And they do that as a way to engage our attention span. Because they go, yes, readers have attention deficit disorder, or readers are there with their mobile phones playing a game while reading and playing a computer game and watching YouTube all at the same time. That authors seem to think that readers will not sit, that readers will not spend time with their books. And maybe in the modern day, that is rarer. It is a luxury. But this wasn't written this year. This was written in the 90s. And so, again, you have to think about all of these things, that sometimes the approach that we take is very different than the approach that a contemporary reader would have taken, and that an author would have expected a contemporary reader. That our approach now might be radically different. And therefore, if we think of the way it was intended to be read, if we try that, does it work better? And you go, oh, suddenly it does.
I think that is really great, especially like it gives me a lot more, like I feel like we're doing the right thing and trying to spread out the timeline of how long we're taking to read these books. Because originally we were going to try to do 1 a month, but giving more like 6 weeks or even 2 months, like I feel like that's going to create more of a space for reading it at a slower pace, which is what I want to do, because I want to get the most out of reading these books. And I'm guilty, man. As soon as you said that, I literally had the thought to myself the other week as I was listening to an audiobook on like 2.5. I was like, man, I wish I could listen to this on 2.5 and physically read this other book at the same time. And that's, yeah, like I'm so guilty of it. And so, it lessens my reading experience so much. And so that's something like I'm challenging myself to actually do, is to listen to less audiobooks and physically read more and listen slower. But especially with Malazan, like there's so many tiny little details that if you just approach it the way you would normally approach, like with like just trying to get through it, there's so much to miss, you know?
Well, let me first apologize, because I didn't mean to be calling
No,
you.
it was not. You made me feel guilty. You made me feel convicted, which is a good thing.
But the thing is, there's nothing wrong with. First of all, I don't have a problem with audiobooks. Like,
I like audiobooks. Yeah.
You know, if that's your thing, that's your thing. And if you can listen to it at 2.5 speed, more power to you. But not all books lend themselves to that. At least the first time that you're going through it. Now, if you've read a book and then are listening to it as an audiobook, sort of as a second read, and you're already familiar with it, it's much easier then, because you already understand that, you already know where things are going. You already have that in your head. You already have the context. You already know the characters. It becomes simpler. But as a first way through, this idea of I'm just trying to get through it, that's what I sort of react against, because I go, well, why are you reading then? If you're just trying to get through it, if you're just trying to find out what happened, if that is your motivation, okay, that's your motivation. But I don't understand that, because if I want to know what happens in a novel, I can go and look at a summary. I can read the York notes, or the Spark notes, or whatever the American equivalent is. Like, I can or the wiki. I can read the wiki to find out what happened, if I just want to know what happened. For me, that's not what is enjoyable about books. What is enjoyable about books is the experience of going through the narrative, of living in that world, of having, or the other ones where a story is being told to me and I'm listening to it and I'm engaged with it. It's not just about finding out what happens. And, you know, different people have different motivations. And I'm not saying that if that's your motivation, it's wrong. I'm just saying it doesn't work for me. And I can never quite wrap my head around it, because it is so alien to the way that I approach books.
Yeah.
No, I feel all this because I'm a pretty fast reader, but early on, right away with Gardens of the Moon, I purposely slowed my pace down, and I also shortened my reading sessions. I didn't do any, because sometimes, like on weekend, I might do like a 3-hour reading session or whatever. I didn't do any of those when I read Gardens of the Moon. I broke it up a lot more. And I know that helped because I had time to just think about it a lot more. And since there was such density in there, I'm definitely going to do the same thing with Dead House Gates. And that's why I've been waiting. I know Alex and Jordan, you guys have started. I'm waiting till my spring break where I can just read an hour and then maybe read an hour later and be able to stretch it out and just think about it a little bit more.
Yeah. I feel like for Gardens of the Moon and now Dead House Gates, for each time I've basically read a chapter as like when I go to read the book, I'll read a chapter and then I'll put it down and do something else. And that's worked out pretty well. The one chapter in Gardens of the Moon that I think was the most complicated for me, and the one I actually had to read twice, was chapter 2, which was the Siege of Pale. I think that section for me, for some reason, was the one that I read. I was like, that was epic. There was a lot going on. There was a lot of different characters and a bunch of actions and, you know, things that were going on that in that page, to the point that I went back and reread that chapter. And I thought that helped me significantly. And I didn't have that problem with the rest of the book, to be honest. Like the rest of the book, I think, especially once you got to Darujhistan and we started getting more of like the assassins on the rooftop type storyline, it was a little bit easier for it to follow. But I think right from the start, you just have this epic scene with this more magic focus, which is another point I actually wanted to bring up, and just how prominent of a role magic plays in these books than most fantasy I've read, which is a weird thing to say. Like fantasy, you associate it with magic, but the magic in these books is way more epic than most fantasy I've read. And it's just something I wasn't expecting. And so that was another aspect of that Siege of Pale chapter that I was just like, whoa, there's a lot going on here. What are they talking about? What are these warrens? What are these mages? Everyone's a mage. And it was just like a lot of things going on.
The magic is actually... Go ahead.
I was just gonna say the Siege of Pale was a really interesting chapter because of the way that it's told. Because it's not really linear. You kind of like start at the end, and then it goes back, and you're like, okay, wait, I'm back here, and then you make your way, and it all kind of makes sense. Yeah, I agree. I actually did read that chapter twice as well, and I enjoyed it a lot more the second time through. I love the introduction of Tattersail, though. I thought that was really excellent. And then the first time with like the deck of cards as well at the end of the chapter, that was really fascinating. I think we get our first mention of like the spinning coin at that point as well. But my favorite part for me was just the imagery of Moonspawn. Like that was just reading about that. I was like, oh my gosh, that's amazing.
That whole chapter is where I really started to understand how this like started as an RPG, because like as a very avid D&D player, the whole chapter felt so much like a D&D battle. It was so cool, and like the magic system in general just feels very like RPG. And so that's the chapter where I was like, okay, I'm gonna really like this book.
Well, Steve actually had pointed out earlier that only the last part of Gardens of the Moon was actually gamed. Gardens of the Moon started out as a screenplay set in the world, but only the very last part of it had actually been gamed.
So if you didn't know this, Steve London is Steven Erickson, and he is joining us in the chat. So happy to have you here. It's awesome. Steve is asking, question for panelists: why do you think I used a flashback for this scene? Does anyone want to take a stab at that?
I would almost say like the things that happen in that chapter are kind of traumatic. So maybe seeing like Tattersail's emotions and response to the things that have happened before telling us what happened reveals more to us about her character and kind of takes a little bit away from what actually happened and focuses more on the character. And Gardens of the Moon is very much a character-driven book. And I feel like that was a lot more revealing, and it took the perspective more, like it helped us as the readers to focus more on her and her reaction than the things that actually happened.
I would agree. And I feel like, some really traumatic situations can bring out a person's true identity, like their true nature, and what they would do in response to a very traumatic encounter. And seeing our first introduction to her being after the battle takes place, you get a glimpse of her at her like most raw emotional level, and then you go back and see what happened, and you see like everything that led up to that point. And for me at least, that helped me connect with her character pretty quickly, despite it being a relatively short amount of pages that were used to first introduce her to us.
I mean, I would say it has the context, but as far as the actual question, why do I think he used it? I'm going to be honest. I don't know why he did it that way. I like the way, and I like both of your answers, but I like the way it played out because it did provide context after the fact. But as far as the craft of writing, I don't know.
AP, do you have any? I feel like you definitely would.
Jordan, do you have an answer?
No, my answer is the same as Josh. I have no idea. I just thought it was cool.
Well, okay. There's my own personal theory for a sort of a diegetic reason and in-universe reason for it, which is the one that I like. But then there's the more narrative sort of structure reason for it. Which one do you want?
Both. Take your pick.
Both, yeah.
Okay, so the in-universe explanation that I like, that I enjoy, is that the Siege at Peel, the amount of magical energy that was unleashed is so much that, as we see with Hairlock being placed in the body of the puppet, rent of the world is worn thin, and the sort of like the crossing of the veil, that allows chaos to enter the narrative. And therefore, that is almost warped. If you think of it as a film, that this has been so traumatic, it's actually warped the film and caused the film to look back on itself. And so we have this whole thing, because the magic was so intense, it actually causes a sort of temporal dislocation of how the narrative is told. That's the
amazing.
only sequence. That's the only sequence we get outside of a chronological sequence in the novel. The rest of it flows through, obviously, with the exception of Krupp's dreams, which are metaleptic. But that's my sort of in-universe explanation for it, because I like the idea that the magic was so powerful that the world is basically torn asunder, and that has torn the narrative and caused the narrative to become twisted. That's how explosive this battle was.
That makes perfect sense, especially because, like, I mean, what I said.
I like that.
Yeah, because what I said is cool, but like, why did he only do it at this one moment in the book then? So your explanation makes a whole lot more sense. Why now?
But the other reason is it's the same reason why we have flashbacks in lots of things. So if you think of Iron Man, brilliant example of this. You have Iron Man, and he does the whole thing, and then the bad thing happens, and it's sort of left on a cliffhanger. And you jump back in time to find out, how did he end up there? What did what led up to this? And you have a similar sort of thing here. Bad thing has happened. Let's take a step back. Let's find out, now that we know that something is bad is going to happen. We know that as a reader. We're now going to see what happened. And we're paying more attention because of that, because we know what the consequences are. You already know the ending. You know the aftermath, and the aftermath is the important bit. So you get the aftermath, you get what's happened, and then you get back to the aftermath again. So it focuses our attention on the important aspect, which is the aftermath of the violence. And it allows us to remember that that's the important part. If it had been done the other way, if you didn't have a flashback, you would have had then the big battle. Oh, wow, isn't this amazing? Flashbang, all of this stuff. And then it all sort of tails off. You would follow that as a very standard, typical structure. And you would be focused then a lot on the battle as the climax. This actually shifts the emphasis and the focus onto the repercussions of the battle.
Well, it's kind of a microcosm for the book as a whole as well, because traditionally you wouldn't have like this massive battle that takes place literally in the second chapter, but it does. And so the battle happens somewhere where you think that would happen at the end of the book, and then your attentions are, diverted somewhere else. So that's interesting.
Yep. Yeah, Steven says the series is all about consequences. And I really like that. I think just the structure of it showing that the importance of this is not the battle or not this big magical energy explosion that is happening on the page. It's the aftermath of it, the consequence of that event and how it affects the characters that were involved. And that is, I like that. I think that is very interesting. And I think my guess is it'll be a persistent theme that shows up through the rest of the series, I would guess.
I'm sure.
So the Siege of Pale is also our first introduction to a character that is pretty prominent in Gardens of the Moon, in addition to Tattersail and some of the other main characters. We also get introduced to Anomander Rake, who is on Moonspawn, defending Pale, and he has been for a while before he retreats at the end of this battle. What did you guys think of Anomander Rake the first time that you saw him, or you read about him on the page?
When he walked into my house. Okay.
Yeah, we got coffee.
Don't recommend that.
For me, he was the sole character going into the series that I'd heard people talk about. So I think there was a little bit of anticipation for me, just wondering about this character, because he's the one everybody talks about, and he's the one in a lot of the art that's just so epic. And not the introduction, but I don't know if it was his final scene where transformation, just blew my mind. That was not what I was
so cool. That was like one of my favorite scenes in the whole book.
I already liked him because he was almost, he was in a lot of the scenes, but he was almost still just a really mysterious character, and that just added to the mystique for me. But I love that character, and just the fact that he was in the epic scene with the moon initially. The whole thing around that character. I think I said I did a vlog for Gardens of the Moon. I think I said, I don't know the last time I've been as excited for a fantasy character as Anomander Rake after finishing this book. So I don't know how much more he is in the series, because I know it bounces around, but I hope we see a lot more of him.
I agree.
I guess I'm actually curious on that point, which AP, maybe you don't want to answer this or not, but I'm just curious and then there are so many players, but in this book, who would you say are the players that we really, really need to pay attention to as we move forward?
All of them.
Thanks. Yeah, I know.
Cool.
That's why I knew that was gonna be.
I gotta get my flashcards.
Yeah.
Ian, seriously, what did you want me to say? You don't want to give me spoilers for the whole series.
Yeah, sort of. Like, I'm gonna sleep with the book under my pillow at night. I've heard that helps you like memorize.
Digest, yeah.
Just absorb the information.
Oh no, I'll just have the audiobook playing as I go to sleep. There we go. It'll ingrain itself in my brain.
On like half speed, so it's just like really getting in there.
Brilliant.
One of the things that frequently gets said about Rake is that there isn't a POV of Rake. We always see him externally. And of course, like, we repeat this all the time. And it's not true, as someone pointed out to me, that there is a POV from Rake's point of view when he's a dragon at the end. We get that very short section from his draconic point of view. But apart from that, we see Rake externally. And, you know, as Josh said, that makes him mysterious, because when you are inside a character's head, when you get those thoughts and you understand everything about them, it can be great because you feel you get to know them better, but they aren't then mysterious. They aren't. Harry Dresden is not a mysterious character because we're constantly in his point of view. We know what he thinks. We know what he wants. We know what he's trying to do. Whereas some of the characters, all of the other characters in those books, because they're all external, they are more mysterious. It's more interesting to try and work out what their motivations are. And so with Rake, one of the things that I really liked about it, and Josh mentioned this, was how he is introduced. Anomander Rake, the Dark Lord of Moonspawn, Chaos Mane. He has all of these epithets, all of these names, and you're just going, oh god, another stereotypical Dark Lord. It's an emo Sauron wannabe. Oh wow. And yet one of the very first times that we then see him later is when he is talking to Baruch the alchemist, and he sends his envoy Crone to ask permission to enter the room. He's not Sauron wouldn't send someone to go, do you mind if my lord pops by for a quick chat? So he comes in and he's polite and he chats to Baruch as an equal. He treats him as an equal, and suddenly you go, hang on, I thought he was a Dark Lord. I thought he was this uber mysterious, uber powerful. Why is he behaving this way? This seems, maybe I've misjudged him. Maybe I've looked at him from a certain perspective, because that point of view was from the Malazans. That was them looking at him as an adversary, them looking at this mysterious figure who is standing so far above them on a floating mountain, this mountain that is floating above the city. And this figure has come out, and this one person is facing out against the entire army. And so he is above them. He is powerful. He is mysterious. He is a legend. He is this magical figure. But behind all of that, he's also a person. And with the change in perspective, you're with the Malazans. You go, oh, the Malazans are the good guys. No, the Malazans are not the good guys. Look at all of the horrible things that they do. The Malazans defeat Pale, and to pay the Moranth, they stand back and let the Moranth slaughter people, men, women, and children in that city. Oh, aren't we on the side of good? When they need to take Darujhistan, their first plan, let's hire a bunch of assassins to kill people. Their second plan, let's lay a bunch of mines in the road. Yeah. Oh, these are the good guys. And that's where we get this challenge to our perspective. This is something that I think is very important to think about in the series as you're going forward. Who is giving you the information? What point of view are you with? Why do they look at things that way? And one of the terms for this in narrative theory is focalization, where a point of view is focalized through the character. So the character's bias, the character's perspective is shaping the reality that we are receiving. And because of that, of course the Malazans are going to look at Rake as an enemy, and they're going to other him. They're going to demonize him because that's their knowledge of him. But when he's an ally, or when he's on your side, like he is in Darujhistan, yes, he's powerful and he's mysterious, but he's not this evil, maniacal overlord. Baruch doesn't go, oh, he's scary. You know, that's not the reaction that Baruch has. And because we are then privy to it, it is asking us as reader to consider how we form that impression and signaling to us when characters give you information, it will be from their point of view. This is not an objective fact about the person. It's a perspective of them.
Yeah,
I like
that's a great point. Yeah. And I think that happens a bunch of times with the characters in this book, but Rake is probably the one that now that I think of it, that you get that the most, even though you're not getting, like you said, outside of the one area at the end, you're not getting his POV from throughout the story.
I mean, he has such a big reputation, so it makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. He's such just this massive presence that you're basically just getting information about him from other people throughout the entire time, regardless of what side they're on. And then that kind of shapes your opinion of him to the point that when he does turn into a dragon, you kind of have this whole new idea of this type of character that is very different in most likely is very different from what you thought of him at the beginning of the book when he was first introduced.
Plus he turns into a dragon. That's just cool.
Yeah, exactly.
Heck yeah, that's cool. That's all.
Raises the epicness.
So cool, so cool. I feel like this discussion is making me realize that I read very differently because I'm that Elmo meme where he's sitting on the toilet just kicking his feet. I read much more like just I'm along for the ride, having fun, and I feel like I don't read nearly as analytically.
But Jordan, did you enjoy the book?
I had a great time. I had a lot of fun with it. So
yeah, then how you read it is absolutely perfect. We all approach reading and understanding books from a very personal perspective because it's based on what we've read before, what mood we were in, the knowledge that we draw on, the circumstances that we're currently in when we're reading it, and why we are reading it. Like you're reading it for a read along, which gives you a different. If you just picked it up randomly and no one had been talking about it, you might have a very different attitude.
Yeah, definitely.
But you take the book as you find it, and we all have different appreciations. We all have different things about it that we're going to like or dislike, and that is always fine. I have never had any problem with someone saying they dislike the book. One of my close friends doesn't like the book. We're still friends, even though he is categorically and objectively wrong. But,
there it is.
But he doesn't like the book, and he has all of these different reasons. I go, well, okay, I disagree with those reasons. I have evidence for why I disagree. But he has evidence for why he has those opinions. And you're like, yeah, because we approach it differently. And that is absolutely fine. And as long as you're getting something out of it, then I think that makes it a worthwhile read.
And I think it's also the whole point of the discussion, because if we weren't meant to bring new perspectives and ways of looking at the book to each other, then we could just sit here and say like, yeah, I liked it. You liked it too? Okay, cool. All right, bye.
Cool.
Yeah. No. As we discuss, we find out more about it together. So it's that just shows, Jordan, that it's a great thing that you're part of this discussion. So there you go.
I'm here to bring the vibes.
There you go. You're doing a great job.
Whereas I'm here to bring the gray.
There you go. The wisdom.
We'll start calling you Gandalf the Grey, full of wisdom and
my wife would strenuously object to anything coming out of my mouth as being called wise.
Very nice. Side note, I kind of want to make my YouTube bio emo Sauron wannabe now. Because when he said that, I died. I was like, emo Sauron wannabe.
New Twitter handle.
There it is.
All right, so I think with that we've already pretty much touched on it, but we're in Darujhistan. We have all these new characters. We have Krupp. We have the assassins like Ralik Nam and the thief Crocus, who we see sneak in pretty early right away into the like the princess's room of that city. And
Alice?
yeah, not princess, but in addition to that, we also have the other side, which are the bridge burners who are being sent in by the Empress to undermine the city of Darujhistan from within, and then deciding to plant bombs in the middle of the street and doing it that way.
It's when you said undermine, and you go, no, just mine.
Just mine the city of Darujhistan.
You're not wrong.
Literally. Did any of you guys feel overwhelmed by the characters at this point? Because when you basically switch to a whole new part of this continent and get introduced to all these new characters,
I felt it actually. For some reason, for me, when it got to that part of the book, I found it easier.
Yeah,
but I've
maybe
always,
it's a little more
I've always,
traditional setting.
yeah, I've never struggled. That's not an aspect of reading I tend to struggle with is characters.
Yep.
But I mean, early on, I had more trouble in the whole book just understanding the factions and who was with who and all of that. But as far as the characters, once we got to Darujhistan, that was some of my favorite parts of the entire book. I mean, you just named some of my favorites in the book.
Yeah, I agree. For me, that was my favorite. Every single scene in Darujhistan was my favorite part of the book, and it was easier to follow, which I'm sure was a deliberate thing and added to the atmosphere of that city and the characters that you're following in that city. And you get this whole new look at the empire from the people that live in this last freestanding city of Ganabakis. And I really enjoyed it. I agree. It was much easier for me to follow for some reason. And the characters were all over the place in terms of their personalities, including Krupp, which is one of the first ones that we get introduced to, which is outside of Anomander Rake, probably the character that I've heard most people talk about. I think,
understandably,
I would say.
Yeah.
I was surprised on the Discord people saying they were annoyed by him. I guess because he spoke in the third person, but I loved it.
I loved it.
Yeah, I thought it was
I loved where we found out who he was. I mean, I loved everything about that character, and he's another one that I hope returns because I know that not all characters end up, they're in and out of the series. I hope he returns, but yeah, I love that character, the eel.
What about you, Jordan, Ian? What do you guys?
Yeah, I think I agree that Darujhistan was like some of my favorite scenes. I also found the characters that we like focused on while we were in Darujhistan to be easier to follow, like the bridge burners and all of them. I had an easier time keeping track of who was who. And also I was pronouncing Krupp differently, but good to know. But yeah, I was saying Krupp.
No, like group.
like group, but group. But yeah, I thought his character added a whole, like, I felt like his character was for me there to like help figure out what was going on. Like, even though the way he talked was kind of confusing, he helped provide a lot of the context for me of like what was going on because he was involved with like everything. So I felt like his character really helped me get a footing in Darujhistan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can agree with that. And I think it was easier to follow. I think I was a little bit less engaged for some reason. I think it might have just been because I was so enamored with and in awe of Tattersail and all of the stuff that had been going on in the previous chapters that when we switched, I was like, yeah, this is cool too, I guess. But but it was still very good. Yeah.
Well, did any of you, when you were introduced to the Daru crowd, the Darujhistani group, did any of you think of Athos, Porthos, and Aramis, and then Crocus as the young D'Artagnan?
Obviously, no, I didn't.
No,
I'm sorry.
No, now you say that, I could definitely see that, but not what I was reading it.
That to me, that was one of the big things that stood out. That I saw the Three Musketeers in the formation of that group. But Crocus, remember we were saying earlier that in fantasy we come to expect to have things explained to us. Crocus is very much that fantasy style character, the callow youth, the character that is young and dumb and needs the world explained to them. And that's partly who Crocus is. That's our sort of point of view character, who is running around and doing these things in the city and things happening to him that we get to experience. Whereas Krupp is a delight. And anyone who says otherwise is wrong. Clearly. Obviously.
Objectively.
But interesting, Krupp was...
Sorry, that was really loud. That's so funny. Oh, that made me cackle.
Brutal.
Oh, Bryson.
Bryson,
Hey,
holy.
Good. That was so good. It was so out of nowhere.
But one of the like little facts about Krupp was that was a character that Steven Erikson gamed with Ian C. Asimov. That's one of the characters that he actually gamed. And Krupp, as you know from the book, he's an illusionist. He distracts people. He is casting all these little illusions and making things change all around him as he steals from them. And Steve actually happened to mention in a conversation that he had an illusion spell that made him sweat anytime they were meeting their employer. And so he would cast it so that he was constantly then mopping his brow. And when they were gaming it, he actually had like a handkerchief or something, and he would be mopping his whole face like this as he was acting out the scene.
That's amazing.
That just became part of Krupp's character. So when he was writing this up after they'd done the screenplay and then he had turned it into a novel, a lot of that was the internal knowledge that Erikson brought to it because he had played that character. Whereas in Ian C. Asimov's books, he never played that character. He only ever saw that character and interacted with him. So Asimov's books, where Krupp has appeared, it's the same character, but it's told from that external perspective. So even though he's given you Krupp's point of view, it's Asimov was external, so he knows Krupp differently. And so they come across as slightly different, these two different renditions of the same character. They have all of the same traits, but you just see that they're slightly differently rendered because one was internal and one was external.
All right, I need Steven Erikson and Ian C. Asimov to write a memoir of their creative process for this book because I would love to it'd be so fascinating, especially somebody who like loves to write, like just to get an inside look on like how they developed the characters, what was in the RPG, what was in the original screenplay, all of it. There's so much history with this story alone that's just so fascinating.
Yeah. Philip has a good question saying, what did our panel think of the gods, such as Opon? I think it's probably how you pronounce it. For me, I loved one of my favorite things in fantasy, and I don't see it that often, is when there's intervention of gods and higher beings within the events that are going on in the real world. And there's a ton of that in this book.
So much.
Yeah, like but the coin motif that they're talking about in the chat is a good example of all these characters constantly hearing that. You have the Warrens where you see Quick Ben and a couple of these characters constantly go in and talk to like Shadowthorn and Cotillion, I think is like the other demon that's possessing Sorry. And I just thought it was very interesting. I think a couple of series that do this as well, like one is Dandelion Dynasty, which is a very different series, but I really liked it in that as well. And I just thought it was a really interesting aspect of this book that I'm excited to see progress throughout the Malazan Book of the Fall. But what'd you guys think of Opon and
the gods? Were honestly like one of my favorite parts of the whole story. I also love like godly intervention in fantasy, and I think that this first book is probably like one of, let me figure out how to word it, one of the most prevalent uses of having the gods intervene. I'm not finished with Dandelion Dynasty yet, but they're kind of more like in the background, kind of pushing things around. But like in this book, we really had a lot of like
front and center.
Like they like had discussions with the people, and like that's, to me, that was just really cool. And also again, being the D&D nerd of the chat, that also felt very like D&D-esque and like RPG-esque, where like the gods are directly helping you. They're providing you your magic and your power and everything. And I found it so fascinating. And that's like one of the things I'm most excited to learn more about as we continue.
Yeah, just kind of to echo that, like I love Dandelion Dynasty, and in that series, like the gods have a very hands-on approach to intervention, but a lot of times it's stuff that we as the readers see, but the characters don't see.
Yeah.
But with this, it's the characters are very much as in on what the gods are doing as we are. Especially like when the biggest incident, maybe not the biggest, but one of is everything that happened with Perrin. Is that how you guys pronounce it? Or,
yes, that's how I was pronouncing it.
I was saying
like
Perron, but
Perron.
might be wrong.
Okay, what is it, AP? Perron or Perrin?
But Stephen Erickson will tell you that I mispronounce
Payran.
every single name in this here.
It's Payless. No, but like with him, like he seems like this big character, and then all of a sudden he's dead, and you're like, oh, he's dead? What? But then the gods are like, no, you're not dead though. Actually, hold on, we need you.
Nah,
we're gonna let you come back.
Backspace.
That's a big I've never seen quite that level of hands-on before, especially when it was like not even like at the end of the book, like, oh no, this character we care about is dying, and then it's like, just kidding, the gods save him, and that's the end of the book. No, it's like in the middle. Not even in the middle. It's like the beginning, practically. He seems like he's gonna be big, then he dies, and the gods are like, no, you're not dead. You're fine. So that was
I ended a reading session at the end of that chapter and went to bed thinking, oh, this character I love's dead, and then the next day, oh, okay, we're good.
Like right away.
That's how all the characters reacted too. They're like, ah, he's dead, and they're like, there's this corpse, and then he's just like, no, I'm here, and they're like, oh, okay, cool.
On that note, what'd you think of the rebirth? It's Tattersail, right? Who died
Tattersail.
So cool.
I liked that. I'm a little bit not nervous, I guess, but I really like Tattersail as a character the way she was. So I'm curious to see how that continues with this whole Silver Fox thing and what her story looks like from this point on. So
yeah.
I feel that about
I really
about everything. I feel that about everything.
Well, I feel like we've really
we've
just like a prologue to the series.
I mean, really, and that's how I feel.
Like,
I mean, I think of a lot of the characters, and I just wonder where they're going to go, and I hope we see them. Like, it's funny when I was reading it, one of the characters that I didn't think was one of my favorites, but is weeks later, is I keep thinking about Quick Ben quite a bit. For some reason, that character just there's just something there that I just want to see what happens next. But the same thing with Tattersail and the two characters that really changed quite a bit. I just wonder what's next for them. I mean, I wonder if we will see Sari, or I forget what she was called at the end, but like those two characters that totally transformed. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I just wonder where it's going to go. That's my whole thing right now is like, what's going to happen next? I can't wait.
Yeah, I can definitely see the series being one that is incredibly rewarding upon reread.
Yes.
Like just kind of seeing the characters' journeys and everything that happened to them and all that. I can see like a reread being a very different but very special experience. So.
Yeah. Well, it's like we said at the beginning with the flashback. When you know how it ends up, then as you're reading through it, you have that, I know where this is going. Oh, don't make that. Oh, I know that you are going to make this choice, but don't make that choice because I know how it works out.
It adds a certain tragedy to it.
Yeah.
And this is something that I always wonder about when people go, oh, like I hate spoilers. But if you know where it's going, you actually you do have a different experience, but it can be equally, if not even more rewarding than going in blind.
Mm-hmm.
But I suppose if you go in blind, you can read it once, and then on a reread, you can have the rewarding experience of knowing where it's all going.
Yeah. It's funny, that kind of reminds me of like my experience of reading, I don't know how many of you have read this, but Carrie by Stephen King. And I think it's totally fine, like, as well, that like everybody knows kind of what happens in Carrie, the, like big scenes of it. And I read that book having known what was going to happen, but Stephen King spoils it throughout that book. Like as you're reading it, there are these little flashes to like interviews from people who were at the scene of whatever. And so something terrible has happened, but it adds a different level of anticipation and like almost fear as you get closer to it. And I think that's very similar. So,
but even like Herbert's Dune, it starts out, you know who the traitor is. From the very beginning, you know who the traitor is in the book. It's not oh my God, where did that come from? It's like, you're told. And you're reading all the way through and trying to figure out why he's the traitor. And then when the moment comes, and then slowly it's explained. So there are all these different techniques and different emotions and things that can apply and create feelings in you as a reader. The whole you mustn't know, and then it's a surprise when you work it out. That's one of them. But there are other things, and sometimes they can be equally rewarding, if not more.
I completely agree.
Like right now, at the same time reading this, I'm also going through A Song of Ice and Fire again, and I've read that multiple times, and each time it adds a different layer. And so even though I know, like for the first book, for example, there's a big event at the end for a character, and even though I know that it's coming, on a reread, there's just a way different perspective on all the decisions that are being made by that character along the way that add a certain tragedy, like you said, Ian, along that whole journey that really changes the reading experience, doesn't take away from my initial reading experience, but also doesn't make a reread any less valuable to me, having that knowledge of what's to come.
Some of my favorite series of all time are ones that, like this one, like don't spoon feed you stuff. So when you go back and reread it, it's like you just get all of that information again, but it just reads so differently every time. And everyone knows, but the Locked Tomb does that for me. You knew it. It was coming. I knew it. But like when I was reading this book, I felt similarly as the first time I read Gideon the Ninth, because I didn't know what was going on, but I was loving the vibes and I was loving what, like, all the characters and everything. And I can totally see that reading this again after reading this whole series, I will probably like it even more.
I love this question right here.
I do too.
Before we go to that, but this is why I object to the term spoilers, because spoiling something means ruining it. And you go, just because you know the outcome doesn't mean that it has been spoiled or ruined, because it's not always about the outcome. It's about what the outcome means. It's about how we get to the outcome. It's about the ramifications of it. Like, those things are sometimes far more important than the actual what. Which, to circle back to what we said at the start, the what that happens in this book was really, really clear to everyone. The why of it, the how of it, there were questions about that. And the more you know about it, the more texture, the more depth, the more color there is to the world, the more powerful the narrative. And so it's not knowing the what. People could tell you, oh, Rake turns into a dragon. Like, oh, you just totally spoiled that. You go, but it's the scene where Rake is a dragon. You go, wow, it's the scene that's important, not the fact that he turned into a dragon. And I think sometimes we gloss over that distinction. We get so focused on any element being, oh, don't spoil it. I want to discover it for myself. We become very fixated on that. And there's an element which I think is very clear in Gardens of the Moon. I've made that argument before. But someone pointed out to me that it isn't confirmed until Deadhouse Gates. And so I have steered away from mentioning that one fact, because I got shouted at for it. And I've had to apologize to the person. Because they went, I didn't know that. I didn't find that out until Deadhouse Gates. But it was something that I thought was really, really obvious in Gardens of the Moon. But I'm so petrified of giving stuff away. Because people get really upset.
They really
send you angry messages.
Yeah, it's complicated. Like, I've tried to, if I say something is spoiler free, I really try to be strict to that. And sometimes it's happened where I've been called out. And even if it's like something that's included on a dust jacket cover of a book or something, like some people will be like, that's still a spoiler. And it's just like, okay, I know, but
it's kind of hard to do a review of a book.
Like, I want to tell you about a book, but I can't tell you the title of it because that'd be a spoiler.
So Amanda from Shelf and Stable asked, some readers say that they read death as inconsequential in Malazan. How do you guys feel about it being less of an end and more of a catalyst of change?
I think personally that it adds a certain level of excitement to the book for me. I don't necessarily see it as inconsequential because there are consequences. It's not necessarily for the individual, but for the people around them as well. I mean, for both, really. But I think it just adds a certain level of unpredictability to the story. You know, like if somebody dies, you can say like, oh, they're dead. That's the end of their story. But is it though? Because there's something else that you have no idea. It opens up a realm of endless possibilities. So I really like it.
Yeah, and I agree, but I also wonder as they change, like, what is Tattersail going to be like? And I wonder about that. Is it going to be the same character? Is it going to be different? So it's almost like a wait and see.
Yeah, I think it like changes the consequences of death, because even if it's not permanent, like it's kind of, you get to see like what does it change about that person, if anything, you know.
So it's not that it's inconsequential, it's just that the consequences are different than death would normally be.
Yeah. It's less
it's not what we understand.
Yeah.
It's not what we understand of death, but as an identity and like a person or character's certain specific situation could be totally changed by it, and they find themselves in a whole new different position. Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. It's not something you usually see in fantasy, let alone any other types of stuff, especially, you know, most discussions around death are the fact that it's final and like can offer more of a bleaker look at it. And that's what I've read in some other fantasy stories. And this one does offer, say, you know, it's not final. There's this whole opportunity for endless possibilities of what could happen at that point in time that could have dramatic impact on the rest of the story to come and other characters that are still alive before this character died. And it's just like, it's something that is unique to the genre of fantasy that I think is really interesting. And this, you know, this book and the series overall already is just going all in with that kind of, with those types of things. And like I was talking about with the magic earlier, and it's something that really has made that stand out from a lot of other fantasy I've read.
I think if people say that they read death as inconsequential, either they are misreading or they don't know what the word inconsequential means. Because there are consequences to every death. Like categorically, factually, there are consequences. It is therefore not inconsequential. If they mean that it is, lower stakes because someone could come back, tell that to all the bridge burners that died at Peel. They don't get to come back. Herlock gets torn to pieces and his spirit is ripped from his body and stuffed into a marionette. And you go, oh, well, look, he didn't have to die. He's a possessed puppet that then gets shredded. Oh, my God. Oh, what an existence. Harren gets knifed, is left for dead, and on the cusp of death, as he stands before the gates about to enter the realm of the dead. The way that we talk about someone, they've seen the light and they're going to the light. And then a doctor steps in with the paddles and brings them back to life. Here we have God stepping in going, no, I'm going to stick you back in your body and force heal it. And he's changed by that. There are consequences for that. There is a debt that has to be paid, which comes up in later books. There are consequences to this. But the idea that death is always finite. The Greeks didn't believe that. We have Orpheus going to the underworld. We have Heracles going into the underworld. We have all of these stories about underworlds that can be visited, going to the Egyptian realm of the dead and coming back. We have people who believe in angels and visitations, about necromancers who can raise the dead. The entirety of D&D and Forgotten Realms has the ability to resurrect characters for a cause. This is not something that Malazan is made out of whole cloth. It has been part and parcel of the fantasy tradition, of the epic tradition, of legends and mythology for basically as long as humans have been telling stories. Just because it's not the modern mode of, oh, well, death has to be final. Why? A lot of people in this world do not believe that death is final. They believe in an afterlife. They believe that you can commune with people in the afterlife. They believe that people can be possessed by the spirits of the dead. You go, that's people in this world. And you're telling me that because a fantasy book does it, that, oh, well, it's inconsequential then. And I'm sorry, it gets under my skin when people say that, when they are ignoring the consequences, the very real consequences. Tattersail's lover, Callet, is killed at Peel. Because of his death, she's upset, she is distraught, and she's confined to her room, hooks up with Perrin in a sort of life-affirming, oh, we'll just throw each other at the way that people hook up at funerals and at weddings because of the heightened emotion. And you go, that's a consequence of Khalat's death, and Khalat doesn't come back. Not everyone gets to come back. It's a rarity. And you can't control it. It took Opon directly intervening to save Perrin's life. Do you think Opon hangs around all the time and saves everyone? No. The vast majority of people who die in these books stay dead. But that doesn't mean that it is a final barrier that can't... It's a doorway that can open both directions. If you can trick the Guardians, if you can mess around with things. Exactly the way that millions of people on this planet believe right now. And so there's... I really do struggle with this one. There are consequences to every death. How people react to it has consequences. It changes the people who are affected by it. The same way that if you have a near-death experience, it can radically change you, or not. Some people come back from it and they aren't changed, but other people might treat them differently when they find out. There's a complexity to it that I enjoy. And so that's why I feel if people say that it's inconsequential, either they have misread or they don't know what the word inconsequential means. That would be my answer.
I agree.
Yeah. Amanda follows up saying, I agree it's misread when people feel like there are no stakes because, well, they just come back. Death is by far not the worst thing that can happen to someone. And I think that's a very important theme that's in Guardians of the Moon and Dead House Gates too. And probably the rest, definitely the rest of the series. That like,
who wouldn't want to become a possessed puppet?
That was one of the first moments of the whole series where I was just like, "Oh man, so this is what we're doing. Anything can happen."
Like, I was like, he literally
gloves off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But so a few people have brought it up. We talked about her a little bit, but the whole subplot of Sari being possessed by Cotillion is how I'm going to pronounce it, and becoming getting out of that possession at the end and becoming Apsalar or what her name is.
Nailed it.
What? Thank you. What did you guys think of that subplot? Like, because that was one that I was very intrigued by the whole time, because all these other characters, the bridge burners that were surrounded by her, were saying something's off, something's weird. She's acting, full tilt in her character. She's bloodthirsty. What is wrong with this character? And it was just something that you're constantly being reminded about from these different viewpoints. And then you've learned that she's possessed, and it was what'd you think about it?
I'm gonna chime in real quick because actually I'm so sorry guys, I'm actually gonna have to log off a little bit early, but I love everything about Sari's story. I mean, she does some things that are questionable easily, but I will say she had some good reasons. I mean, being possessed by certain people will do that to you. But I agree with you, Alex. Just the way that people talked about her and everything just immediately had me fascinated by her. And so anytime she was on the page, I was paying very close attention. And it was a rewarding, if frightening experience. So, yeah. But, yeah, I'm so sorry I have to hop up early, guys. But thank you all so much. Thank you, AP, for joining us. And I will be going back to rewatch. Yeah, of course. I'll be going back and rewatching these and leaving comments later. So,
Bye.
all right.
See you, Ian.
Bye, guys.
Have a good night, man. Anyone else? Josh, Jordan, AP, what do you... Spoiler.
Yeah, basically
I
what Ian said. Yeah, basically what Ian said. Go ahead.
Yeah, same thing. I loved the revelation that we got, although then you look back and you kind of remember remember the beginning of the I don't know if that was in the prologue or if that was chapter 1, but
it's like
you remember the
right at chapter 1.
But yeah, it's like you remember the scene after the fact, and then, but I'm just, again, another one where I'm curious if we're going to see her again and what she's going to be like as a different person. But sorry, I'm still laughing at Ian saying questionable. Some of her actions, yeah, they're a little more than that.
I think one of the things I find interesting about Sari as a character is, well, when you think of the bridge burner squad that she's in, they refer to her as the recruit.
Mm-hmm.
She's been with them for a couple of years. Like, Perrin's been trying to track her down for 3 years, and they refer to her as the recruit because they're distancing themselves from who she is, like how dangerous and dark she is, that they almost don't want to let her into the club. And it's at the end she actually gets to choose her own name, because she's nameless at the very beginning. She's just an unnamed fisher girl. Then she gets sorry, which is basically given to her, because it's, I think, the first thing that she says as Cotillion is possessing her. And then she's referred to as the recruit by the others. And then at the end, she gets to pick her name and become her own person. So it's a very interesting journey where the name is actually telling about some of the stuff that's going on.
Yeah, I like that. That's Amanda saying I felt sorry for sorry. It's like,
right, yeah.
At the end of the book, when they all say that they're gonna take her back to her like hometown or whatever, yep. I was very surprised because I didn't think that's something she would want. And some of that has kind of been talked about where I'm at in Deadhouse Gate, so I'm very excited to see how all of that kind of resolves, because like she's been through so much. Like, what is even there for her back where she's from?
And how much of it is left? Remember that that's the scene that Perrin was walking through, almost knee deep in gore. And that when Sorry turns up at the recruiter's office and he looks on and goes, "Oh, red mud, where did that come from?" And you're like, it's not red mud, it's dried blood.
Yeah.
She's walked through that.
Eric says her original name Sorry embodies Cotillion's regret. Wow. I like that.
Wow. That's dark.
So I have another question that's like kind of about the structure of the book in and of itself, but character-wise first, I do want to talk about Adjunct Lorne and the Talani Moss that joins her, Tool, or he has a longer name that is technically his name. Tool, who they go to looking to resurrect the Jaghut tyrant. Someone's here.
Sorry, that was mine.
They're going to resurrect the Jaghut tyrant, and I think, you know, at that point when we first get introduced to Tool, we had already had mention of all these different variety of races and types of ancient races that are in this world. We have had look at the Tistiandi with Anomander Rake, and we've had mentions of the Jaghut and the Talani Moss, and then we meet one of them with Tool, and I just thought that was, you know, it just added to the whole epicness of this world that was kind of just in 450 pages was really just thrown at you in a way that I enjoyed. Did any of you guys have any, you know, initial opinions about Tool as a character? Did you trust him, or did you?
I didn't trust him at first, but I loved him by the end. Yeah. I didn't trust him at first, but yeah, I loved him at the end. And actually, you mentioned Lorne anyway. That it's interesting because, well, I already mentioned Quick Ben, but Lorne's arc is the other thing I think about quite a bit about this book. That I don't know if I dwelled on it quite as much when I read it, but I think about it quite a bit because there was so much that she went through, and Tool was, I wouldn't say it was a favorite at the end, but I definitely love that character.
Yeah, I also what you were saying, Alex, I love the like introduction of all these different races, because it just each of these different races has their own different backstories and lore, and it just makes me very excited because I'm sure we're gonna explore more of that in future books, and I love big worlds and lots of lore, so I'm very excited.
When I think with Tool as well, just you get a face with, you know, the race or the being, and that just helps you as a reader understand it so much more.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
He also he has quite an impressive entrance.
Yeah.
Sorry, but as an interesting point, I think about Tool. So Tool and Lorne are traveling together. Lorne's the one who's calling him Tool. This Tool of the Empire, Unos Tool. And yet she is literally the tool of the Empire. She is the one that is the tool and is projecting that onto him. That he is this receptacle for what basically she sees that she is. This automaton doing the will of the Empire. And yet he has some great lines. Like, talking about futility, is like, it's futile. He has a very dry sense of humor, which you would expect for a desiccated corpse.
For a walking skeleton.
Right? Literally dry.
I like what you said there, AP, and it ties back to what you were talking about earlier with the prologue. And Lauren's story is how, despite everything that's happened to her, she has shoved all this personal response back, has shoved it down in order to, be this tool of the Empire that she has kind of become at this point of her life. Tammy says, Tool really illustrated to me just how ancient the world is. There is so much more backstory to the story that Tool has seen so much. And yeah, I agree. This is a world that feels very lived in, feels very old, and it doesn't feel like, we're just hopping in at the start of time for this world. It seems like this world has been around for thousands and thousands of years, and we're just jumping into a certain piece of the moment of this history and seeing how it's progressing from this point on. And I really enjoyed that. And I think that's a great point. And Tool is a great aspect. Tool is a great tool for us to see that happen.
Nice.
in Gardens of the Moon, at the start of each chapter, we get poems and like epic and sayings and songs and other long things that kick off each chapter at the beginning of the book. Some people I know don't like when books and authors do this, or they just skip over them, or they just don't read them, or some people absolutely love them. I just wanted to hear. I was curious what you guys thought of those, because not a lot of books do that, especially to the length that some of the poems at the start of each chapter are, and how like it really just sets the stage.
I've always been a fan. I think back to a different book, but God Emperor of Dune has some epigraphs that I would sit and I would read and stop after the epigraph, because there was so much in there to think about. And I felt with some of these, the poems not as much, only because I'm kind of lousy at poetry, but some of these I would read, and then I would try to think about, okay, how is this going to tie into what I'm about to read? So I've always been a fan of those. So I'm definitely in there for it.
Yeah, I'm kind of on the same page as Josh. I always try to, when I'm reading them, I always try to like see what, if it's tying to something that we already read, or I try to remember like important things as I go into the next chapter. I do find with poetry sometimes, again, also I just don't read a lot of poetry, so I'm not as like well versed in it. I find that sometimes it's harder for me to grasp the importance of it in poetry form. But I do read them. I do not skip them.
They don't exist.
I do know people that skip them, but I do not skip them.
Yeah, I know.
Well, two sort of tricks that might help if you're struggling with the epigraph sometimes. One is, if it's a poem, read it out loud. It's something like we lecturers and teachers have been telling students for years. If you're struggling with poetry or you're struggling with drama, like if you're reading Shakespeare, read it out loud. Try to get a sense of the rhythm of it. So read it out loud, maybe once or twice. That can help with a lot of the epigraphs, because once you get the rhythm of it, suddenly you get the emphasis in it, and it comes alive a lot more, I think. Whereas when you're used to reading prose and you read poetry as prose, you're not looking sometimes for that rhythm.
Yeah.
So that's one thing that can make, in any book, not just the Malazan Book of the Fallen, but in any book that uses poetry or has poetry or songs included, try reading them out loud, because sometimes that can be a real key to getting a lot more out of it. And the other thing is, I would say, particularly with the Malazan Book of the Fallen, when you read the epigraph and then you read the chapter, before you go into the next chapter, go back and reread the epigraph.
I was going to bring
it usually only takes like a very short amount of time. Like, the epigraphs are not hundreds of pages long. It's,
yeah.
Just go back and quickly look over it again, and you go, huh, that thing that happened in the chapter is actually, there's a sense of it here, or it was playing with that. Doesn't always happen that way, but it happens frequently enough that just as a general trick for anytime you encounter epigraphs, read the chapter, then go back and reread the epigraph to see if it ties into the chapter. And that sometimes can be very, very helpful.
Yeah, that's a great point, because that's something I didn't do. I didn't go back in Guards of the Moon, but I've been doing it with Dead House Gates, actually. And I wish I had done that in Guards of the Moon, because I found that it really does, you know, both emphasize everything that you are about to read, but also after you read it, it just like really helps kind of set the tone of what you had just read previously.
So it helps you consolidate it.
I like them. I like Matt was saying that those people don't read the songs of Lord of the Rings either. And yeah,
they're so long. They're so long though.
And somewhere an angel has lost, or a fairy has lost its wings.
Also, as Steve says, he gave so much away in the epigraph, so they're clues to what.
No. Steve thinks he gave so much away.
Yeah. From our point of view, I'd be like,
so obvious.
I'd be like, I have no idea.
Me and my one brain cell are like, nope, I'm not getting it.
Yeah, I'm saying.
I do like finding Easter eggs in there. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, no.
Like one of them is what Eslain Monot, the dubious, and you go, that seems remarkably similar to.
So I think, you know, we're an hour and 45 into this discussion. So I think I kind of want to bring it to a point where we talk about, you know, the ending of the book, because I think a theme of Malazan that I had heard before going into this series is so much about convergence. It's a word that I've heard more people say when it comes to the Malazan Book of the Fallen than a lot of other terms or descriptors. And convergence is something that I fully expected to happen in the series. I expected it to be like book 3, book 5, whatever book it is, to have converge events that happened earlier in the series. Guardians of the Moon, I mean, it's a huge point of this book right away. You're already having big convergences at the end of the book from all these other threads that have been laid throughout the story leading up to that. I wasn't expecting that. Even on a reread, I like forgot some of these things happened, and it was just epic. Like I thought the Siege of Pale was epic, and then we got to the last 100 pages, and I was just like, "Whoa, this is!" I mean, you have Anomander Rake turning into a dragon, and all these other characters coming in. You have the duel with Rake and what's that guy's name? Simtal's the guy who works like like the sword duel. You have the house of Azoth or Azoth or Azeroth, or I forget what it is.
Azoth House.
Azoth House.
Yes.
And you have all these things coming together and pulling all these characters together with the rise of the Jakku Tyrant as well. And it just was super, like, epic is a word that I feel is like the only word I can think of that would describe my feelings towards the last bit of that book. But how do you guys feel about that? Did you expect all of those?
But it wasn't the big battle. I mean, we still had the biggest battle was in the beginning, really.
Yeah.
That was maybe a little bit of a surprise when, you know, like Rake goes to a party or something like that. Matt, I like the way Matt explained it in the chat there. He said it starts with a siege and ends with a garden party or something like that. So it didn't end how I thought, but I was also surprised how many of the characters did just converge upon one another in the last third of the book, not just at the very end. And of course, you always enjoy that when you're seeing them in different places and you see what happens when they do interact with one another. So I, of course, like that part of it as well.
Yeah, I think that ending with, like you were saying, with everyone coming together and you're kind of seeing like their interactions with each other, it helped me put a lot of context to everything that went on previously. Like when we were talking about how confused we were about like what everyone's position is in this world. That ending really tied that all together for me. Not completely. There was still a lot I was confused about, but it really did help me like put a lot of context to what happened earlier in the book. So I really liked the ending a lot.
Yeah. I agree. And it was interesting. I think, Jordan, you brought it up earlier about Apsalar and her ending of this book, or Josh brought it up. One of you brought it up with how she's going back home, and does she even want to go back home? And these characters are volunteering to take her. I think Kalam and Crocus, and and you have all these characters basically starting off on their journey. And I think in a non-spoiler way, it's something that's well known about the series, that as we were talking about at the beginning of the stream, these books are, episodic in nature in some way. There are like, before the live stream, we were talking about, could someone start this series off with Deadhouse Gates before reading Gardens of the Moon? And I, like AP was saying, sure you can. And I think because of how Gardens of the Moon ends, you have these characters that are going in these different directions, and you're not going to see them for a few books or the next book or 2 books from now or whatever it may be. And I don't know, like AP, when can we expect to see some of these characters again, other than, the ones that we may see right in Deadhouse Gates? Like, is it something we have to wait for book 6 to see some of these characters, or is it?
See, when I said that you could start with Deadhouse Gates if you wanted, I wouldn't advise it. I still think you should read Gardens of the Moon first. It's the first book. Read book 1 before reading book 2. It's, I'm old-fashioned that way. But theoretically, you could, because there's a lot of implied reader knowledge. Because when you're reading Deadhouse Gates, it's implied. The author is assuming you have read Gardens of the Moon. So the author is assuming you already know that stuff. Now, of course, when you're reading Gardens of the Moon, it comes across quite often that the author is assuming that you've actually, the history of the Malazan world, and that's why
you live there.
which is one of the reasons why I think, theoretically you could start with Deadhouse Gates. I wouldn't advise it, and I think it's better as the second book. But you could also go Gardens of the Moon, Memories of Ice, and then do Deadhouse Gates, House of Chains. There are lots of different ways you could shuffle it around. I would just read it in publication order. But like all of these things, when you think of these important storylines being set up, as Josh had said earlier, stuff gets introduced. And then when Erikson goes, it is now time to return to that, to that's when you see it again. Not before then, not just because you had a hankering for it, or you went, why can't you just do it all now? But you don't need it now. This is when you need it, is in this section. So I think a lot of the structure of the books follow that. And how the story is set up follows that. That there are, in terms of what is going on, the big event that this is all sort of coalescing around, there are a lot of different strands that require being set up. And one way of doing it would be lay it all out for the reader. Like, set it all out. But that would be very boring. That would be a lot of exposition of going, you need to know these things, and it's this, and this. That would be a lot. It would be exposition heavy. It'd be a lot of info dumping, but it would get everything out of the way. And then you could just head off and do what you wanted. But what the tack, the direction that Erikson chose was to go, no, we'll explore this thing here. Then we're going to explore this thing here. Then we're going to explore this thing. Trusting and hoping that the reader will trust him to bring it all together. And he does. It is a 10-book series. And it concludes. Yeah. And all of the major elements, all of those things are tied up there in one form or another.
Yeah,
but I think that happens. Yeah, I think that happens even with more traditional series too. I mean, I think of Wheel of Time, a much more straightforward tale, but there were characters that disappeared for multiple books. So it's probably just a lot more prevalent in this because of the realism, but that's not unheard of in fantasy for that to happen. So just hopefully our favorites don't disappear too long, right?
The thing is, when you read, like, say, Ian M. Banks' culture novels, like each culture novel, they're all part of the culture series. But they have different characters in them. They're set in different places. And you go, but they all form together to form a mosaic of the culture. And people don't go, oh, well, that's not a proper series because, you know, you're not following the same character. We have this bizarre fixation that fantasy apparently functions by entirely different rules than any other narrative form. That fantasy must do that it must follow a small group of characters sequentially, chronologically through a quest. And you go, no, why? Why is there this expectation? When we don't expect it in science fiction, we don't expect it in horror, we don't expect it in all these other genres. We don't expect it in literary fiction.
Yep.
So I find it weird. But at the same time, of course there are going to be characters that you like and you want more of their story. That's perfectly natural. And wanting more of that is fine. But wanting and needing are two different things.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. And I think no spoilers at all. Deadhouse Gates, at where I'm at, I'm already very invested in the characters that we didn't have in Gardens of the Moon. And I'm halfway through. And I just think that's what I think that takes a lot of skill for an author to pull off. I don't think a lot of authors could do it, even though it's something that we see, you know, not infrequently in fantasy, with characters disappearing and new characters being introduced, and all of a sudden having to realign what you think of certain characters and getting reinvested in new ones. I just think how Erikson has done it so far in just these first two books is very impressive, and I'm excited to see where it goes from here. All right, so we are an hour and 55 into this. I don't want to keep AP too late. I know it's probably what 1 a.m., 12:30 or something.
It's just coming up to 12:30. So what I was going to say is, does anyone have any specific questions for me?
I just have one. Yeah, I just have one going forward for me and Ian, because Alex and Jordan have already started Deadhouse Gates. Going into Deadhouse Gates, I mean, do you have any just reading advice or just general? What should we expect, with no spoilers, of course, but I think anything along those lines is what I.
Full spoilers.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that you see in Gardens of the Moon, while there was a focus on specific events, it was always focused on, one of the big things was the impact of it, why things were happening and the ramifications of those things. That's an important aspect to bear in mind. And the other is thematic stuff. When you're reading, bear themes in mind, that it's not just about the literal what just happened. Think about it in terms of, okay, well, that's one story over there that's doing that thing. How does that relate to this storyline? Think about actually comparing stories, because they're completely different events. Why am I seeing these two events? What do they have in common? What are the common elements that they are exploring? And I think once you cotton on to that technique, once you realize that usually there are thematic links between what you're being shown, it actually makes understanding what is happening a lot simpler. But without going into spoilers, expect the unexpected, because Gardens of the Moon is probably the most overt postmodern take on the genre, because it was trying very deliberately and overtly to subvert a lot of the expectations of genre norm, and doing it in a way that felt part and parcel of the world, that it was integrated in the world, not just for shock value. That style is still going to be present, but less overt, and just paying attention to the language, paying attention to the short story techniques, the implied characterization, the reading between the lines, paying attention to focalization and subtext, paying attention to these things, because with those you get a greater understanding of what's happening. And you know, there are people out there who can do that reading at high speeds. I can't. I need to take books like this a little bit slower. And that's part of the enjoyment for me. So just relax into it. Trust that Erikson will eventually get to the point. Much like me. I'll eventually get to it. Erickson just happens to do it a lot more eloquently and more entertainingly, which is why he's enough. But he will bring it to a point. And if you trust in that process, if you believe that it will have a payoff, then go along with it. And I think that every single book in the series does that, that it pays it off in a certain way.
Everyone in the chat is saying bring tissues. So as somebody, and I know Josh is the same. I know Josh is the same. We're criers when we read, so I'm a little nervous. Don't worry, Alex won't need tissues, though. He never cries. He has no emotions. Didn't even cry in Jade Legacy. Like
I did.
Doesn't
mean it's not great. Didn't hit me emotionally. Crying's a different thing.
But yeah, I think that it's an important thing to remember that not everything is going to be spelled out to you or spoon-fed to you. That again, it's like what we were talking about with how Lorne at the beginning, that scene at the beginning that Gano's parent is watching that, how it has ramifications for the dinner scene with Lorne and ramifications for her character. That's the sort of thing that you pay attention to. That where these points of connection are made, you go, oh, that actually, this all now connects up. That is paying attention to those character motivations, understanding where they're coming from, how these events of the past affect the present. That's all just important stuff.
Awesome.
Well, thanks. That's very helpful. I think it's a series like this, it's easy to get wrapped up in trying to figure out where everything is, who everyone is, and what are the structure of all these organizations, and looking at a map and figuring out where is who and who is what, and it's just like
read it.
It's reassuring to hear. Yeah, I think it's reassuring to hear because I feel like so far when I've done that is when I've enjoyed these books the most.
Yeah, I think one of the big things that people I think struggle with Gardens of the Moon is they're trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
Instead of just so I don't understand it yet, or I'm not fully aware of what you go. Yeah, well, okay, I'm okay with not knowing at this juncture in time. I'll read on, and oh look, as it just went out, a couple of chapters later, it's just been explained. Right, fair enough. If you relax into it and trust that Erickson will eventually explain it, 99 times out of 100 he does. And then 1 time out of 100 he rips your heart out.
One time. Well, I mean, with that said, that's all I have. Does anyone else have any other questions or anything they wanted to bring up related to Gardens of the Moon?
No.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone in the chat for joining us. It was awesome having everyone ask questions and comment. Thank you to Josh and Jordan for joining, and I'm excited to keep going with this read along. And a huge thank you to AP for joining. This was a pleasure and just really helped at least my, and I'm sure everyone else's experience with reading Gardens of the Moon this time around.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you once again for inviting me on. I'm sorry that I tend to fade towards the end of these things, but it does get a little bit late here. And at the end, it's slowly
understandable. You're great.
But thank you so much. This was a lot of fun, and like I've always said, like I enjoy these conversations because everyone brings a different perspective to it, and you all have different points that you love or even dislike about the books, and that is wonderful. That's part of why we come together as a community to talk. So thank you for allowing me to be part of this.
Thank you.
Thanks again for joining. All right. So with that said, we'll see you all. Dead House Gates. See everyone.
Woohoo!
Yeah.